This is the last of the topics that concerns the sort of the politics. So from next week on, we'll actually be focusing a lot more on the debate in Finland, right? So slightly different focus. So what we've basically seen, just to put this in context, what we've seen so far is the idea that, you know, basic income itself, different models pose implementation challenges, practical challenges, right? So this is Lindsay Sturton was talking about possible fiasco scenarios. But one of the key points there was that implementation is not just about practicalities. There's a lot of political choices involved in this as well, okay? So that was kind of the start of the politics scenario. The lecture last week got us into politics in a straightforward sense, thinking about constituency, thinking about, you know, who is the political base in a particular society where you want to implement basic income. The topic of today is a follow-up on this, and that looks at the other side. You know, this is like, who are the elite agents, the stakeholder, the interest groups, the political parties, and so on, that we need to get on board. So think of this for a moment. You know, think that you are a basic income policy entrepreneur. You're the sort of person who wants to put basic income on the agenda. So you need to, in a sense, look on both sides. You need to look at the base. You need to start really, really thinking of who are your supporters at the base. And you need to think of, you know, the elites, like who are the political parties you can bring together? How can you build a coalition that is both broad enough to carry basic income and stable enough, right? Something that can last over time, in a sense. So the topic today is very much about this coalition part. And again, you know, it's kind of the same strategy that I did last time, which is, I'm going to look at a couple of arguments that people sometimes argue for, saying that, look, oh, basic income is great, for example, because both left and right support it, therefore it's really, really easy. A lot of my arguments are like, well, it's not that easy, right? We need to really seriously think about it. And again, as before, this is not in any way an argument against basic income. You know, it's just an argument about taking the politics of basic income very seriously, okay? So nothing of what I'm going to say here means that basic income is never going to happen. It just means, you know, it's a lot of work, as you would expect once you take a policy proposal very seriously, okay? So this is what we'll be looking at. We'll look at, very, very briefly, I'll say something about, you know, the background politics, political commitment. And then we're going to identify and run through three problems. Problem of cheap support, problem of persistent disagreement, and also problem of political stability. Okay, so the first two of these, cheap support and persistent disagreement, you know, is very much based on that article that you had to read. So if you've read it, you'll be familiar with it, but you know, hopefully I'll be able to explain it still. The political stability thing comes from a very different type of article, actually, but it's actually an issue that's very related. And then we'll look very briefly about, you know, the idea of political strategies. What should we be doing? Okay, so here is the idea of political commitment. So my suggestion here is that political commitment is very much the core of basic income politics. The big challenge is that we need to get individuals, groups, organizations genuinely committed. And commitment is different from just support, you know. Support could be something like an expression saying that, like, I like basic income, I'm in favor of basic income. But that's not enough. Commitment is something more, right? And we'll go through what that means as we talk through this lecture. So just a couple of basic points, and some of this you may remember from the introduction. I've mentioned this before. I just want to put it back in focus. The first idea is that when we're thinking about basic income politics, we do face a battle on two fronts. So often enough, we talk about basic income advocates versus the people who are against. You know, and that's the first front, right? We always have to argue for basic income against the people who are against, right? Assuming that you are for, of course. I'm taking the position here of someone being in favor, you know, but the politics is the same either way. But then the second thing is that within the camp of those who are in favor, people are in favor of very different models. And that's a second battle, right? So imagine if you are a basic income advocate and you are, say, an advocate of, say, a quite radical progressive version, you need to argue against the people who are against. And you also need to argue against the people who are in favor of basic income but a very different model, right? So that makes it quite a bit complicated. Now, anyone who's seen Hollywood movies or you've read up on some military history, the worst thing that can happen to you is that you have to fight a battle on two fronts. You know, all the wars with battles on two fronts are usually the ones getting lost. Let's hope for basic income that's not the case. So I don't want to be too depressed here. But a second key point, this is something that we've talked about in the introduction. When we think about different models, they produce different policy effects and different political effects. So policy effects is all about who wins, who loses, okay, what will happen in society, the sort of things that we can measure, you know. But the political effects is all about, you know, how easy is it for one model of basic income to become political reality versus another model, okay? How easy is it for one model of basic income to stay a political reality? Because one of the things we'll talk about towards the end is, it's not because you have basic income now, or tomorrow, or the next day, that you'll have it 10 years from now. So, you know, so one really important challenge in politics is not just to get something on the political agenda, also to keep it there, you know, to keep it in place. And on the political effects, so the first thing we talked about last week was this idea of a constituency. So different models of basic income will have different effects for different people, therefore different people might support it, but they might support different models. So that's, you know, your first complication. The second point, then, kind of building on that, is that when we think about the lead stakeholders, think about political parties, think about interest groups, think about policy entrepreneurs, whatever you want, it's the same thing. So different models will gather support from different political parties and so on. Now, partly that is because of the constituency. Say a political party will look for a constituency and will, you know, because it needs votes, right? Very straightforward. But this is also where something like ideology comes in. So a political party doesn't just think about constituency, it also thinks about other things, you know? So this is where coalition building is not quite the same as constituency. If political parties were only interested in constituency, then we didn't need the extra analysis, but it's not the case. It's a separate thing. So the point then is that what we basically want is commitment from key stakeholders, right? That's the building block for any strategy. So that's partly what we're going to do today, namely come up with a number of arguments why getting this commitment is not very straightforward. So this is the first problem, the problem of cheap support. So the problem of cheap support, in a nutshell, very as a summary kind of thing, the idea basically is that many people argue at the moment in the basic income world is that we really have a lot of support at the moment. If you were to put a graph, you know, maybe I should have done that actually, but if you were to put a graph of political support of the last 20 years, it would be something like this, and then suddenly it started going up, right? And especially the last 5 years, the last 2 years, the last year in particular, it really, really goes up. So what does that mean? It means that if you were to look online, you find a huge amount of politicians suddenly saying, I'm in favor of basic income. Or stakeholders of various things, business leaders, you know, trade unions is complicated, but even some trade union people, you know, would actually say would be in favor. Religious groups, I mean, you name it. You name a whole bunch of social movements, stakeholders, interest groups, political parties, politicians. You see a lot more support than what we had a couple of years ago. And, you know, so the question then is, does that really mean anything? Right? So that's the big thing. I mean, the fact that you see all these people, all these groups, all these movements, do you see them expressing something like support? Does that really mean anything? Is that how we want to measure support? Do we, in some sense, do we just want to do a numbers game? Do we just want to count the amount of people, the amount of organizations who are declared to be supportive? Is that enough? Is that what it means to have political commitment? Or should we, in some sense, look at action? Right? Should we look at what is it that these groups actually do as opposed to what they say? Right? The answer actually probably is somewhere in the middle. And here is the reason why. Action is great, but of course not every group or not every person has the capacity to have action. Right? So it may be that an interest group is willing to put some resources, just didn't have the chance yet to do so. So we're interested in all these things. We're interested in how people express their support, we're interested in the action, and we're interested in sort of the willingness to put proper commitment in there, right? So, but the starting point of this slide, in a sense, is that we can't actually really just play the numbers game. If we just count what's out there, does that really tell us anything? Well, I'm going to say no, right? And I'm going to say no for a number of reasons. The biggest problem is that political support, in terms of just expressing support, saying that you're in favor, doesn't always mean anything. It doesn't always have any value, right? And the reason why it doesn't have any value is that if the only thing you get from a politician or a political party or an interest group and so on, from now on I'll just say politician, but it's a shorthand for a whole bunch of different groups, right? If you don't get a commitment, if you get support from a political party or a politician, that doesn't mean that we have proper commitment, right? Commitment means very different things. I mean, here's just a list of the sort of things that politicians or political parties or groups can do. They canvass support. They go out on the street and talk to people and get the constituency building going, right? They actively promote things in various ways. They devote resources. Now, resources are scarce commodities, for political groups as well. So here's just 3 of them: time, money, organizational resources, right? And keep in mind that a lot of these, politicians or political parties, they're committed to several things. So they have to make a decision and say, now look, how much of these resources am I going to spend on basic income as opposed to other actions that I'm in favor of, right? How much of my time am I going to spend campaigning for basic income as opposed to other things? How much of our money are we going to spend? How much of our organizational resources, okay? It's not that obvious, this is costly stuff. They have to spend political capital. Political capital is reputation, For a politician to have political capital means that what they say, what they support means something. And if they attach their political capital to a lost cause, that's going to have consequences. If their reputation goes down, that's a problem for them. This is a big thing. So, bargaining and log rolling. Bargaining and log rolling is, typical political practice. This is all about, look, I'm a political party, I want to be in favor of basic income. You're a political party who's against, or you don't care, but you have another cause, say environmental issues, animal rights, for example, whatever. I don't care about animal rights, so we're going to go into a trade. We basically say, look, I'll support your animal rights bill if you support my basic income bill. That sort of stuff. Now again, this is not free, right? This is all about, look, I get something, but I also have to give something. So this is a costly thing. This is how political parties and how political groups do politics. This is the difference between commitment and simply saying, oh, I think basic income is a great idea. Big difference. So the second point on that is now having support. So on the one hand, it's this idea of commitment, but also, you have to have the capacity to engage in action, right? What that refers to is the idea that there's a lot of politicians or political groups or other groups out there who can say whatever they want. It doesn't really matter much to us. Why? Because they're not in a position to really influence the debate or influence the policy process. Maybe the debate a bit, but not the policy process. So here's just 2 examples. If you look across Europe, the green parties across Europe are usually in favor of basic income. So why hasn't it happened yet? Well, one of the reasons is that green parties usually are opposition parties. They're small parties, They are doing very important work, but they are not decisive in the policy process, right? And actually, funnily enough, when they do get into government, often what you see is that they drop their support for basic income. We'll get to that point in a bit. But the key point is on political parties. If a lot of the small political parties are in favor of basic income, how much does that really help us, given that, what you actually need is a broad coalition? You find that not just in political parties, you actually find that in interest groups as well. So think about trade unions. I was saying earlier, trade unions is complicated. So the myth is that trade unions are all against basic income, but that's not true, right? You will actually find in trade union movement people who are in favor of basic income as well. And you often find smaller trade unions to be in favor. But unfortunately, smaller trade unions have exactly the same problem as the small parties, right? I mean, from our perspective. If you're interested in pushing basic income on the agenda, having the small groups, whether it's trade unions or whether it's political parties, in favor, just doesn't help that much, right? I mean, it's great, it's very nice of them, but it doesn't help us in really pushing things onto the agenda. So that's fairly straightforward, right? So let's put a complication in here. So when I put forward these ideas, people often come back to me and say that, but hold on. You know, you're being too pessimistic. You're always being too pessimistic. Because maybe the commitment now is great because in the future it'll pay off, you know. It's important that we have this support now. Because who knows, things might change. Perhaps some of these green parties will come into government. Perhaps some of these small trade unions or other groups somehow get involved in the policy process, you know, and it's good that we have the support now, even of the marginal groups, and we just, you know, it's like putting money in the bank. You know, you put your 10 euros in the bank, it doesn't get you much, but over time, if you wait a couple of 100 years, at some point, you'll have enough money you can actually buy something, but, okay, this is again me being too sarcastic, but you get the point, right? So you know, even marginal supporters, we shouldn't waste that away. We shouldn't be too pessimistic about that. So here's my problem with that argument. It suggests that cheap support is sticky. What it means is that once a group or a politician or a person is in favor, they stay in favor, right? It's something that you can count on. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There's really no guarantee in politics that people will have the same views as we move across time. Why not? Well, here is one of the reasons. If one of these groups, one of these politicians, one of these political parties is in favor of basic income now, because they are marginal, it also means that they have no cost attached to them. So as they become more important, it also becomes more costly for them to support basic income. Think back of all the resources they have to spend. They have to spend time, they have to spend money, they have to spend reputation, political capital, right? So in the future, it may be that these groups become more helpful to us, but at that time, it also becomes more costly for them to support basic income, right? And that's a problem, because it means that in some ways they have a lot of reason not to support basic income any longer. So here's just a couple points. I mean, in some sense, dropping controversial proposals is actually a very classical political move. And so Anthony Downs, who is a very, you know, he's one of the classics of political science, has this idea, this model of the median voter. He basically argues that all the politicians compete, the political parties compete for the people in the middle, you know? There's no point, if you're a left-wing party, you don't have to compete for the people on the left. Why not? Because the right-wing parties, they're never going to get their vote anyway, you know? I mean, let's put an example. If you're Hillary Clinton, I mean, at the moment now in the primaries, you know, it's all versus, you know, Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders. But the moment, imagine that Bernie Sanders drops out. I mean, Hillary Clinton has to start competing for the Republican voters. Because in principle, all the other voters, they're for her anyway, right? Assuming they actually turn up. So that's the model. So everyone competes for the person in the middle. But that also means you drop the controversial points. So as political parties get in power, they have to drop their controversial points because they have to appeal to broader voters. Some of you may be aware of what happened with Podemos, the radical party in Spain, in the run-up to the last elections. For a couple of years, Podemos, which came up very, very fast, basic income was a big part of their agenda. You know, when they were coming up, they were talking about basic income a lot. And then they were putting their economic program before the election, and basic income was dropped. Why? Well, electorally speaking, this makes sense, because in an election, they already have their radical supporters. These people are not going to vote for someone else, right? That bit they've sorted. What they need to do is they need to appeal to other voters, including people towards the center-right. So you drop the controversial program, okay? So that's a classic move. We see other scenarios of people changing. So, for example, we had a green paper on basic income in Ireland, right? So in Ireland in 2002, there was a green paper, government sponsored, made the analysis. Nothing happened after that, right? And actually the Greens, who were in power at that time, right? Sorry, no, not at that time. The Greens were in favor of basic income at that time. They actually became in power in 2007, and they totally dropped basic income as well, right? So the moment, this is a classic example of a group that was marginal at one point, big supporter, and then actually dropped it the moment they came into power as part of a coalition. Why? Because they were making strategic decisions. They basically figured, look, if I want to be part of a coalition with, at that time, a right-wing party, there's certain things I can push for, but I can't push for everything. So one thing I'm going to drop is basic income. So it's very unfortunate. So all these people who are always saying, oh, but it's great because the Greens are in favor of basic income, and now they're in the coalition. It's great. Finally, our time is here. Nothing happened. Okay? So this is just to illustrate, and I'll leave the Brazil example. This is just to illustrate that there's really no guarantee, because we have support in one time, that it's going to stay the next time round. We need to be careful about this. Okay? And actually, so this is, to put it differently, political commitment is something that, you have to see in the moment. It's very, very difficult to keep political commitment as something that moves over time without any investment, so to speak. Right? So here is another problem, a very peculiar one. There's something called toxic cheap support, or what I call toxic cheap support. So this is actually the following argument. Sometimes it's a problem if some political parties or politicians support basic income. Why? Because the fact that that party supports basic income means that other parties want to stay away from the proposal. So the moment basic income gets tagged into a particular orientation, whether that's the left or the right or religious groups and so on and so forth, you can do different things, right? The moment it's perceived as being part of a very specific political agenda, it gets identified that way. That's actually a reason for parties or politicians or groups who are on the other side of that agenda to totally forget about basic income as well, to even push against, right? So one of the things, I call this a first mover disadvantage. So, in some sense, it's important who are the first supporters. And, if you can think ahead, if you can do political strategy ahead, you might even want to avoid certain parties or certain politicians becoming in favor, right? One of the problems that we have is what I call marginalization by association. So, this is not actually to do with the basic income proposal as such. It's to do with the fact that certain groups are identified by it. So here are two examples. Both in the case of Namibia and in Ireland, this is actually a proposal. Basic income is a proposal that's very, very much tied in with strong religious groups. In Ireland, the people who were pushing basic income for the past 10, 15 years, they are literally, they're a priest and a nun and part of a religious group, right? And if you know the background in Ireland of Catholicism, and especially things that have happened in recent years, this is very, very controversial, right? So religious association is a problem, and it's a problem for groups who really want to stay away from the religious aspect. So, I'm not making this up in the Irish case either. This is not just speculation. I've literally talked to people who said that they thought basic income was a good idea if it wasn't for the people who were supporting it, right? Now, in the last couple of years, luckily things have changed because more other groups have started to get involved. So you see a very important shift. But this is a tricky thing. Here is another example. In some countries, Germany and in Belgium actually, we actually had entrepreneurs, liberal entrepreneurs, pushing basic income agenda, like millionaire people, right? This is like, both Du Châtelet and Götz Werner, they're millionaires, they own a huge amount of business stuff, and they're coming up and saying that basic income is a great idea. But of course, their version of basic income is very entrepreneurial. So what you suddenly have is a lot of the groups and the movements who are on the left, who are more into poverty and so on and so forth, not into poverty, combating poverty, right? they are very worried about this. They're very worried about supporting a proposal that is actually being driven by, what they perceive as the right-wing liberal entrepreneurial side, okay? So again, same scenario. The fact that these guys support it can help in one way, but can be a problem in another way, okay? It can marginalize the proposal with people who otherwise would be very, very sympathetic. And in all fairness, if you look at Finland, it's a very, very interesting thing that in Finland basic income was traditionally promoted by people on the left and now is being picked up by center-right government. So I'm one of these people who is very, very interested to see what's happening. And I think in many ways we need to do some serious research about how the different political parties actually react to this, right? And we'll see what happens when the government starts really running the experiment. Because at the moment, we don't know yet what exact proposal the government puts on the table, right? So everyone is watching out. But this sort of stuff is going to start happening, right? So what is the logic of cheap support? So I've given you kind of different sort of little scenarios and examples. So the logic of cheap support is basically the following. If we have support from people who are, or political agents who are marginalized or incapable or unwilling to really commit, right, then we really have a genuine problem. And the cheap refers to two different things. It's cheap for people to endorse basic income. It has no costs, no consequences, right? Like if all you need to do is say, I'm in favor, then that's very cheap, that doesn't cost anything, really. But that also means it's cheap for us who want to put basic income on the agenda because there's nothing we can get out of it, okay? And here is the really tricky thing. This is where the logic becomes problematic. The moment it becomes costly for political agents to support basic income is also the moment they're going to drop out, right? And if they drop out, then that's a problem for us. If they stay, it is because, it is because they have cheap support and therefore it's of little value to us. So either way, it seems we have a problem, okay? That's the very unfortunate logic of it. So for support to become valuable, we need to get back to this commitment. We need to find a way to get political parties, politicians to commit actual resources, not to just express support, commit actual resources. And to do this along the way and not dropping out along the way. And this is very tricky, right? This is really very problematic. Is there any escape of the logic of cheap support? So, one sort of a little political sciencey point here. This is actually a version of a general problem that political scientists have figured out is a real issue. They call it the free rider problem. Mancur Olson, back in '65, wrote a classic book in which he basically figures this out as the free rider problem. So what is the free rider problem? Think about trade unions. Why do people join a trade union? Well, actually, really, you shouldn't. Because, if you are a free rider, the logical, rational way to behave is not to join a trade union, not to pay your membership fees, not to get involved in protest. Because really, it's much better that everyone else does this. Right? Because your single contribution doesn't mean that much, right? It's costly to you, but it doesn't contribute that much, right? And at the same time, if trade unions negotiate for higher wages and better working conditions and so on and so forth, you benefit from this as well. So, so the free rider option as an individual is to drop out. Of course, if everyone does the same thing, then the whole system goes down, right? So trade unions are very aware of this. Trade unions want to find ways to commit people to become members. So that's why they add selective incentives. So, in some cases, trade unions, for example, have special negotiations for the members, right? They have all sorts of privileges. Becoming a member is not just about supporting a trade union, it's about getting these special incentives. And that applies to pretty much every type of group issue, right? So the logic of cheap support is just a version of this. So what is it that we can offer? So the question then, from the basic income perspective, is what can we offer the people who might support us to make sure that their support is real commitment? And here we really have a problem, because if you look through the literature, there's sort of three versions of things we can do. We can offer material benefits. In some sense you can say, look, if you're a proper supporter of us, we will give you something material in return. but really, what could we give? You know, I mean, basic income as a movement doesn't have anything to offer, really, in terms of material benefits, right? We're not that kind of group. I mean, we're very different from, say, the pharmaceutical industry. You know, the pharmaceutical industry, if they want a policy proposal on the table, they go around and they take the doctors on nice little holidays, and, they go for, you have a nice dinner, which costs a couple of €100. Yeah, sure, bring the wife or the husband along and the children, we'll sort it all out. This all works very well. And then these doctors suddenly start, thinking your medication is really very good, so we'll push for that, right? And, we'll take some politicians out for dinner while we'll add it. Okay, we can do all these things, if you're a pharmaceutical company. That's great, it works. Basic income movement is not like that, unfortunately. We don't have that kind of money. There's not much we can give. So another reason why we can escape this stuff, or another way in which we can escape this stuff, is by, sort of ongoing collaboration. Sometimes we can get support by saying, now look, if you support us on this issue now, we are involved in an ongoing collaboration, and you're going to need our support sometime later on as well. But again, basic income movement is tricky here, because we're only focusing on one thing, getting a basic income. I mean, in some sense, it's not very clear as a movement what it is that we can offer there in terms of ongoing collaboration, right? It might be worth exploring, but it's not clear exactly what it would be. And actually in the literature, so this is called ad hoc issue groups. Ad hoc issue groups are really problematic in the sense that, they're just focusing on one issue, it's a one-off thing, and then that's it. It's very different in terms of the structure, the political structure, compared to ongoing groups. Ongoing groups that are focused on many different issues. So the final one then is reputation benefits. So think of it this way. If a politician commits him or herself to basic income, but then afterwards drops out, is there any cost attached to it? At the moment, not. When the Greens in Ireland dropped basic income from their policy agenda, no one was really telling them, saying that, look, guys, this is unacceptable, and so on and so forth. Or it didn't matter, even if people were saying this, it didn't matter. Their reputation didn't depend on this. But in some cases, reputation actually is one of the things that politicians are very vulnerable at. Right? So we need to, in one way, we need to find a way to make sure that the moment people are committed to basic income, there is a cost attached to it if they drop out. Right? Now that's an interesting avenue, but we need to find a way to do this. So at the moment, I haven't seen anything in terms of how this could work. We'll have to see. So far so good, well, maybe not so good, but so far at least, on the problem of cheap support. So what's the bottom line here? Don't go crazy when you see people just saying, I like basic income. Or when you see political agents saying, I like basic income. What we need is a lot more than that. We need genuine commitment. And getting genuine commitment is problematic because of the logic of cheaper support. Right? There's a lot of reasons for people to be cheap on this side and to bail out the moment it becomes costly. But that's also, unfortunately, the moment it becomes interesting to us. So we need to find a way to escape that logic. And a lot of work needs to be done on this. So here's the second problem of persistent disagreement. So this is actually a very important quote at the moment. So Scott Santons is an American basic income advocate who, is actually really, really doing, a lot of great work. He does a lot of blogging and so on and so forth. And he's very good at putting these, phrases out in the world that are very, very catchy. So one of the things he says, and that a lot of people keep reposting and retweeting, is this idea that basic income is not left or right, it's forward. So I agree with half of that. I agree with the second half, it's forward. We are definitely a forward proposal, we're not going back to some sort of, whatever traditional kind of view. What we're proposing is something quite new, quite different, quite forward. But I disagree that it's not left or right. In fact, my argument is it's either going to be left forward or right forward. And it matters whether it's left forward or right forward. Right? It matters for the constituency, as I've argued last week. It also matters for coalition. So here, and that's the argument I'm going to put forward now. So So is there any sort of sense in which we can get a grand coalition around basic income? So another way to think about Scott Santon's view is simply to say that, look, basic income is really a great proposal because there's people on the left support it and there's people on the right support it. And forget the cheap support bit at the moment. I mean, imagine that this is proper support, proper commitment, right? We have them on the left, we have them on the right, we have them in different groups. That's great. I mean, here we have the building blocks of a grand coalition. It looks like it's exciting, right? I mean, how could this possibly be a problem? You know? Basic income unites left and right, religious, ecological groups, and so on and so forth. The feminist agenda, you name it. You name any particular sort of strong agenda there, and you will find people there supporting basic income. And many people think that this is a very important advantage politically of basic income. And I think it's a problem. I think that argument doesn't work. And here is why. I think political disagreement is something that's very deep and persistent. And the reason why I think that is something I've said a few times before. Basic income as an idea, as a vague idea, a general idea, is something that everyone agrees on. Well, not everyone, but you know, people in all these different groups. They all agree on the idea. But they don't necessarily agree on the policy. And the policy, a lot of the policy details, is where we have these very different policy effects that I've mentioned several times before. And we have the very different political effects, right? So when you think about it for a moment, a progressive type of basic income, one that is focused on getting people out of poverty, on securing equality, empowerment, and so on, is going to be very different in its design, but also its effects from the sort of policy that is basically about, you know, in some sense, reducing the costs of the welfare state, or, you know, securing people into employment, right? That is just a very different type of program. It's a very different ideological program. It's a very different type of program in terms of its goals. But the implication is that it's a very different type of basic income being advocated. And it's going to be very different groups advocating the one or the other version, right? I mean, it's a very straightforward kind of idea. So here's the example. I mean, one of the examples I use often is think about how the left versus the right imagines basic income in relation to other programs in the welfare state, whether it's income maintenance programs or even more. The radical right-wing version, I do say radical, not all the people on the right think that, but on the radical side, you have people proposing basic income as an alternative to the welfare state. They basically say, we'll do basic income. We pretty much get rid of all the other assistance. On the left, you have people saying, we need basic income as a floor. And on top of that, we have all these other programs. Those are radically different social views, political views, right? So you can imagine, if people talk about basic income, you can have support from the left and the right, but the moment we're talking about policy details, including this sort of example, that support is going to fraction. You know? There's no way that people on the left would support a radical right proposal. There's no way that people on the right would support a radical proposal. So what does that really mean, that basic income is not left or right, it's forward? To my mind, it doesn't mean much. You know, it means something at the level of the idea, but not at the level of policy. And let me just make a link to the implementation argument that Lindsay Sturton was talking about. The moment we see this disagreement coming up is the moment we start really thinking about the details and we start thinking about implementation, right? Now you have to keep in mind, I mean, if we're serious about basic income, putting it on the policy agenda, at some point we're going to get to implementation, right? I mean, we can talk about ideas and ideas as long as it's just about talking. The moment this is actual, a reality, then we're going to have to worry about the details and worry about the implementation and worry about the political support for each of these, okay? And the argument here is that if political disagreement is deep and persistent, it's not going to go away, then we have a problem, right? So here is one sort of counter-argument, if you want. Here is again a version where people sometimes say, well, you know, Jurgen, you're being too pessimistic. You know, there's a way out of this. So let's see. So the way out is to think of this as a two-stage proposal. So the argument is, first we lock people into the idea of basic income. And then we move that idea towards our preferred version. So think back at the first slide, what I said. We have these two fronts. First we have to battle the people against basic income, and then we have to battle amongst ourselves for the best model. So this is the version. This is the implementation version, the practical version of that, okay? So locking in basic income under a veil of ignorance. So the veil of ignorance is the idea that, you know, veil of ignorance. So veil of ignorance is a political philosophy thing, slightly different thing. The veil of vagueness is the idea that in politics, we best agree about things by keeping it a bit abstract at the level of principle and so on and so forth. And that works in many areas, so you just push ahead any disagreements about implementation. So could it really work? Well, we have to see. So the biggest question is, how easy is it to lock in basic income into a version that allows to expand towards, say, the progressive side? I'm going to talk about the progressive side now because in the next slide I'll explain that there's a very important asymmetry. In many ways, when it comes to basic income, the conservative side has a lot easier than the progressive side, and I'll explain in a bit why that's the case. So think about the following example, participation income. Participation income is the idea that we have a basic income, but it's not unconditional. There is a participation requirement, but it could be very broad. So it can be employment, looking for work, being in education, taking care of your parents, your children, your partners, volunteering, any sort of thing, apart from just sitting on your sofa like Homer Simpson, okay? So the argument is that participation income is almost a basic income, you know? It's not quite, but it's almost there. So the argument of the people who use this two-stage approach, they basically say, okay, step one, we get the participation income. And step two, we realize that this participation thing is going to be a bit expensive because, you know, we have to still check on people and so on. And it's so close to a basic income. So we might as well just drop the conditions. And, you know, in step two, it'll naturally evolve into a basic income. So here's my worry. It could equally naturally shrink, right? Because if you think about this, imagine we have a participation income, okay? And then I agree that implementing a participation income is incredibly expensive. It's very bureaucratic. I mean, imagine that, you know, the bureaucrats have to come and check at your home to see whether you're really taking care of your mom. I mean, if that's your reason for applying for participation income, then they have to check on this, right? So in some sense, participation income is the bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, pretty much any activity that we do has to be controlled and checked, and, you know, so this is very problematic and very costly and very intrusive. So at that point, there's two options. The one option is we go to the basic income. And that's what these people argue. It will happen naturally. But the other option is that we actually restrict the types of activities that we allow for. And we go back to where we are now, which is we focus mostly on employment and human capital, education. So we're back where we are. You know? So it's kind of like going full circle. Now, if that's the case, and I think it's equally plausible, so I don't know, right? In some society, it could go towards basic income. In another society, it can go towards more workfare. I don't know. But neither do the people who propose this as a scenario. The big point is there's no reason to think it would be automatic, you know? So the argument of the two-stage is, first we lock it in, and then second, it naturally evolves towards a basic income. My point is there's nothing natural about that. You know, it could go that way, it could go the other way. I mean, you know, that's a risk you're taking. So it's not much of a strategy if there's a big risk like that attached, right? Okay? Actually, it can get worse than that. So, oh yeah, this is a little point, before we get to the worst bit. This is the point about path-dependency being asymmetrical. So think for a moment what has to happen. If you're a progressive, you want to move towards a progressive basic income. You have locked in some version of basic income. You then want to shift it towards a more progressive side. Each time you shift it, you have to engage in the political battle. That means you have to spend time, money, resources, you have to bargain, you have to do this, you have to build a coalition. Every step you're taking, you have to do this over and over again. Right? That's a serious thing. There's nothing automatic about it. This is politics, hard politics. So what do the Conservatives have to do? All the Conservatives have to do is block it. Now, blocking things in politics is the easiest thing to do ever. Pushing things is hard work. Blocking things is very straightforward. Pretty much every political system has what's called veto points. And as a Conservative, it's very easy to trigger these, right? Whether this means putting things in the courts, whether this means blocking budgets, whether this means, blocking coalitions, it's very easy to block things. If you want to see how far that goes, have a look at what's happened in the United States since Obama got into the presidency. I mean, there's very little that Obama managed to achieve because the Republicans were blocking everything, right? It's very easy to do that. They're actually now blocking an appointment on the Supreme Court, right? So, but you don't have to go to the US. You find similar examples everywhere in Europe as well, right? It's just that the US are just such crazy examples. I always like to put them out there. So that's the politics. So we're not in the same situation. We're not playing equal in a sense if you go on the progressive versus the conservative side. Okay. So I said before that a two-stage approach is risky because there's nothing natural about it. It's not automatic that it will happen. But here is even something worse. I mean, imagine that where we land could actually be worse than where we are now. So imagine that in some way we get part one, we get something like a basic income, but it actually is the wrong type of basic income. So if I'm a progressive basic income advocate, the question is it better for me to support a conservative basic income, or is it better to leave things the way they are? Okay? Now, many people would say, well, at least we have a basic income, so that's great, it's better. Well, it depends, right? I mean, imagine that what I said before, I mean, some of the really, really radical right-wing basic income proposals, they effectively are combined with dismantling social welfare programs. So imagine the combination of a basic income that dismantles a lot of other programs. And then, in some sense, reduces the basic income itself over time. For example, because it actually keeps the amount fixed. So, which is the easiest thing to do ever in politics. And it happens with a lot of programs, right? Every program, as society, as life becomes more expensive, it has to be indexed. It has to, we have to spend more on programs to make sure that it's still there at the same level, given that society itself has become more expensive, right? Well, if that doesn't happen with basic income, effectively basic income becomes smaller, and in the meantime, all these other programs have been dismantled. That's a nightmare scenario. I'm not saying that everyone proposes this on the right, but that could potentially be a nightmare scenario where you say, as a progressive, that's not the risk I should have taken, right? Okay? So is there a way out? Well, the obvious way out to this is, in some sense, forget for the moment about building the grand coalition, taking, in some sense, the grand coalition strategy is to take every vote in favor, independent of whether it's on the left or the right or anywhere. We all count them together and it's great. What I'm trying to argue here is, no, they're not. They're not great. If you're on the right side of the spectrum, then left votes are going to be problematic. If you're on the left side of the spectrum, right votes are going to be problematic. So the way to do it is differently. Make sure you have red lines. What I mean by red lines is there are certain things that you want to put as hard criteria and say, look, we're willing to compromise up to a certain point, but we're not going any further. So, which might mean in terms, think again about the dismantling of programs. It may be acceptable to dismantle some programs because basic income effectively replaces them. But that's not an excuse to dismantle all programs, right? So at some point you need to think very hard and say that, look, under this particular proposal, we're okay going this far, no further. If we get the coalition within the red lines, it's great. we're willing to compromise. It's not our ideal, but we're willing to compromise. But we don't go any further, right? So, and that's a different scenario. That's very different from the grand coalition idea, like left and right, it's all great because basic income is going forward, right? Very different type of scenario. Okay, final problem, and this one is going to be quite a bit shorter. So, basic income, having a basic income in place is very important. We focus a lot now on getting basic income on the agenda for obvious reasons. But it actually is worthwhile thinking ahead a bit, because we actually don't just want basic income to be on the agenda, we want it to stay there. I mean, what's the point in spending a lot of your effort arguing for policy that, say, next election, 4 years down the road, the next party basically says, look, we're going to get rid of this, right? I mean, what's the point of that? So clearly you want to think about political stability. So actually when I think about political stability, I think about two different ways. The first way I call resilience. So resilience is, in some sense, avoiding or trying to combat the pressures to take the policy out of the agenda again, right? I mean, effectively, making it hard for the next government to take out something that you've just put into legislation, right? Okay? But there's another thing, another aspect of political stability that's equally important, and I call that robustness. Robustness actually is about making sure that the policy still works the way you had it intended. The reason why this is important is because it's very easy for a policy still to be there as part of the legislation, but simply not to work anymore, right? And that's a very different thing. So on paper, it looks like we have the policy, but really it doesn't work anymore. I mean, think about something, or here's an example. Imagine that you say, look, we want to crack down on violence against women. We're going to have a proposal, a legislation, which says, look, this is a problem, we recognize this, so we're going to put, men should be prosecuted when they commit violence against women, and we're going to have a number of proposals that mean that, in some sense, women are more protected outside, in the house, at work, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we don't actually put any budget. So, so the proposal is there, it's in the legislation, but really there's no effective implementation, right? Because if we want to make sure that people are prosecuted, it means we need to make certain changes in the way the courts operate, we need to make changes in the way, for example, police officers are trained, they're more sensitive to this. We're not going to do any of that, right? So police officers still don't believe in violence against women, although clearly it's in the legislation. So that's an example of something that exists, and yet it doesn't as a policy, okay? And this can happen with basic income as well. So you can imagine basic income being part of the policy environment, but somehow, nevertheless, being reduced in such a way that it actually doesn't do the things that we would hope it to. It doesn't relieve poverty, it doesn't bring about equality, it doesn't really help on the care agenda, and so on and so forth. Maybe it doesn't even, maybe it doesn't even have the employment effects that people imagine it would have, and so on and so forth, okay? So that's the difference. Resilience, you take it out of the legislation. Robustness, it's still there, but it doesn't work. Both of these are problems in terms of political stability, right? So here are 4 challenges, 4 different ways in which policies can be reduced over time. So the first one is the most obvious one, policy replacement or policy abolishment. This is the very radical one where a government says, look, we're in government now, we're going to take this out. Okay? And this happens, right? I mean, actually, it's happened a lot in the last couple of years. The austerity years, if you look across different countries, governments have been able to do this in the name of austerity. At the same time, this is a very radical way. So governments know that if they take out things, they're always going to hurt at least some of the voters, and that's risky. So they're more interested in doing ways behind the scenes, so to speak, right? So the next 3 are different ways in which we can reduce political stability, but not having this risky scenario going, okay? The first one is policy layering. So here is how layering works. You don't have one program. You actually have another program attached to it, sort of, and it overlaps. And it looks great because we're just building more programs. But as you're building more programs, you're also competing. You're competing for the budget. You're competing for public support. You're competing for organizational resources, right? So one way in which a basic income could be reduced in terms of political stability is by focusing more on the other layers. So imagine, this is a problem of a partial basic income, for example. Imagine a basic income at whatever, 550 euros per month, right? With that amount of money, you still need a lot of other programs. So imagine the government says, okay, we'll build some other programs on top of this. It's great because it's sort of extra assistance, but over time, these are going to compete. And over time, perhaps there's going to be more public support on the other programs, less for basic income, more money spent on the other project, less for basic income. And as it happens, basic income is just going to be reduced. It's going to get squeezed out. I'm not saying this will happen, but it's a scenario. And it's a scenario we've seen in other policies. So it's something that we have to be aware of. Policy conversion, third mechanism. We actually change the goals. We keep the policy in place, we change the goals. Imagine a basic income put in place as a combating poverty device. We're very interested in abolishing poverty or combating poverty, right? Which means a certain amount of investment and so on and so forth. Basic income is part of that. But over time, we're becoming more committed to an agenda of reducing bureaucratic costs, reducing the interventions of the state, securing more employment and so on. So the poverty component gets shifted away, right? The same policy, but the goals change. Now the people who have to implement this, they get little notes from top saying, well, now we're going to focus less on here and more on there. So we have different targets, we have different guidelines, we have different this and that. So the whole implementation shifts. It looks great on paper, it always looks the same. But in reality, it's really totally shifted, right? And that may have a serious implication. And it may have a serious implication for future investments or reinvestments into the policy and so on and so forth, okay? So this is again a different mechanism. Finally, policy drift. Policy drift is deliberate inaction. Every policy over time has to be updated, right? Why? Because your environment changes all the time. So the same policy that you start out in 1980, going to 1990, 2000, and so on and so forth, it may be the same policy, but important things have to be updated in order for the same effects to be in place, right? So what policy drift is simply refusal to update and saying that, look, so you kind of let the policy die out. You starve it out of resources in a sense, right? You're not doing anything. But you're not doing anything, right? So you see the difference? So here is the example for basic income. I mean, think about the level. I mean, you start off a basic income at 550 euros or more, whatever level it is. And keep it like that for the next 20 years. But your 550 basic income now, may do certain things. But from 20 years from now, 550 it's just not going to be the same, right? Very obviously so. But it's not just the level. I mean, we can think about other ways. So, but those are 4 different ways in which a basic income could be reduced. So what is the united feature underneath this is actually the idea that, look, in policy we have all these mechanisms. The only way to combat this is actually securing political commitment. Right? So this is the link between what I was talking before and what I'm talking here. We don't only need political commitment, strong political commitment, to make sure that policy gets implemented. We actually need to keep this commitment going, because otherwise policy may change over time, may disappear over time. Or it may still be there, but it may be totally hollowed out. Right? These are problems. So I'm actually going to skip this. I'm just going to quickly go to a conclusion, and then I think I should stop. So where are we all this? So, well, we need to be aware of political hurdles. So, it's very important that we build a coalition to basic income, but we should be aware how difficult this is. You know, we can't just do these superficial things like just count every level of support, you know, just think that it's okay, left and right, it's all the same, not worry about stability over time. Once we have a basic income, it'll be there always. You know, I mean, and if you think that's a silly way to put it, you'd be surprised how many people think that way. They generally think that, you know, once we have a basic income, somehow it'll be in place and it'll stay there all the time, all the way. I just don't happen to think that that's the case. So we should be aware about this. But in addition, so here are at least 4 things, so 4 positive things that we can do. Raising awareness is a key point in any political strategy, right? So we have to do some kind of clever campaigning, really. This is, in many ways what basic income is all about. If you're ever interested in this aspect, do look at what the people in Switzerland are doing. They are preparing now for their referendum, and they're coming up with really clever things. So one of the famous images, and again I should have put it in there, is that they dumped like 1 cent coins for each citizen in Switzerland on the big market square. So there's this amazing image of a truck dumping a huge amount of, it looks like gold, but it's basically like little copper cents. And it's a very symbolic image, right? It's like, it's this amazing thing. It's free money for every citizen, right? That image went viral and helped a lot, It's actually one of the reasons why newspapers, they loved that image. They immediately got involved, So now for the campaigners, they actually put a competition out for the largest poster. They're going for the Guinness Book of Records, the largest campaign poster ever. So let's see how that's going to work out. But they're almost at the amount of money they need to do this. So clever strategy, it's very obvious. There's going to be window of opportunities. At some point, there's going to be reasons why some politicians or some political parties suddenly become open to basic income. In a way, what has happened in Finland. I mean, I think everyone was surprised when the Finnish government committed to an experiment, right? So what can we do about this? Well, pushing a window of opportunity is complicated, it's tricky, but you can be ready to exploit it. So this is why, in some sense, we're doing a lot of the work now to get ready. Right? We're just waiting for a window of opportunity. We want to jump in there. Increasing political pressure, a very important strategy. Right? Now, so there's 2 ways in which you can do that. The one is by simply putting pressure on politicians. Right? But here is a slightly different version, which is at some point you want to be able to present basic income as the solution. So in some sense, you want to put pressure such that there's bigger problems. And basic income suddenly becomes this very reasonable solution, right? So, and in a way, this is what people are starting to think now. So if you followed some of the debates online, everyone today is talking about technological unemployment. Robots are going to steal our jobs. Now, I have a lot of issues with how part of that debate is going. I mean, we'll see about that. But one of the interesting things for this perspective, for this argument, is that everyone is basically saying that, look, in a situation of proper employment, full employment, or something like that, what we used to have a couple of decades ago even, basic income would be a costly issue. But in a situation of technological unemployment, where the jobs are disappearing, like really massively disappearing, suddenly basic income becomes a reasonable solution, right? So this is partly what you want to do. You want to find something that becomes a problem that politicians cannot ignore. And this is where it gets interesting. A problem that politicians on different sides of the political spectrum cannot ignore. So this is where you want to start building your political coalition. By trying to find a problem that is a problem for the different groups, different political agents in your society, and then proposing basic income as a reasonable solution. And the larger the problem, the more reasonable basic income will be as a solution. Okay? So the question is to just put the pressure on this. And then the final recommendation in a sense is what I call the politics of patience. Don't jump at the first opportunity, right? And this is the difficult thing, because when you think about something like basic income, I mean, for many, many years, people were thinking this is just a crazy idea, and now suddenly people are interested. So it's very, very easy to just jump at an opportunity. But we need to be very careful about red lines. You know, coming back to this idea, not every basic income is the same. We have different models. You need to, you know, if you're a policy entrepreneur, you need to define your red lines. You need to decide which model is the one that you think is acceptable, depending on what you think basic income is supposed to be doing, okay, and how it can work. And then you have to stick to them. And your opportunity may come or may not come, but jumping at the first opportunity, not taking into account the red lines, can get you into all these problems I've set out before, okay? So, for example, in the context of Finland, and you'll be talking about the experiment very much. I mean, one of the things that people like myself, and Pertti as well, no doubt, are very much keen on seeing is what it is that the government is going to accept in terms of the recommendation. Which type of experiment are they going to put forward? How much are they actually going to commit in terms of resources so that the experiment itself can actually generate results on a broad enough range, for example, of goals, right? So all of these things at the moment we actually don't know. So we're waiting to hear. But there's a way where even the experiment with lack of commitment can be reduced to a very, very different thing than if you have a lot of commitment and you have to open it up a bit, okay? So we'll have to see what happens. I mean, Finland is extremely exciting at the moment because we have this experiment idea. But there's still a lot of issues in terms of, what is it exactly that we're going to be able to do depending on what the government decides. Let alone the step after, which is, once we have results, how is this going to be evaluated and so on and so forth, right? So political commitment, when, in Finland at the moment, is a big issue as well. Everything we've been saying here, and even the lecture before, is very, very relevant for Finland, okay? That's it from me for today.